My article comes from the Government Finance Officers Association and details best practices in school budget policies and principles. This association recommends developing a budget that optimally aligns resources with student achievement and suggests that this process will entail making significant changes to long-standing traditions of budget creation. It is important to have a set of principles in place as a touchstone to guard against moments of short-term emotion that could have long-term impacts on the school's financial viability. Goals for student achievement need to drive the budget process. Clear and specific goals will allow programs to be prioritized. At the same time, it is important that these decisions are driven by data and that effective programs are identified based on outcomes. Another principle to keep in mind is student-centeredness. Traditionally, budgets often keep the needs of adult stakeholders in mind. It is important that we keep children at the heart of the decision-making about how funds are used. One area to consider is class sizes. Research has not shown a clear general linkage between class size and student performance, although some modest impacts are shown in kindergarten through third grade. Reducing class sizes can have an enormous impact on your budget without necessarily producing much value. You should also consider the allocation of resources based on need. The RTI framework can be a useful way for considering the allocation of resources, with most resources going to Tier 1 needs in core instruction, and some resources going to effective interventions in Tier 2 and Tier 3. Traditionally, school budgets involve incremental spending. That is, this year's spending is based on last year's. However, past patterns of spending may no longer be affordable or even relevant given the changing needs of the community. Ensure that you implement a program review process, and don't be afraid to discontinue programs if they are not achieving objectives or they are not as cost-effective as available alternatives. Ensure that your budget helps provide equality of opportunity to students, or one might say equity. There should be appropriate resource allocation for groups who are in need. Budget managers need to take a long-term perspective. Schools cannot handle an overwhelming amount of change, and it is better to strive for consistent application of proven strategies than to make a lot of changes in a short period of time. Finally, it is important to be transparent about the budget and be clear on what actions are being funded. Instead of thinking about line items, think about what priorities your budget reflects. Who is receiving the funds and what benefits might they expect to gain? Secondly, it is important to consider policies. These policies should provide guidance beyond what laws and regulations dictate. For example, what courses of action are appropriate and which are not. How will their performance be judged? GFOA has the following recommendations on policies. First, schools should establish a general fund reserve. This should be an unrestricted amount of funds that are maintained to hedge against risk. A target balance for this fund should be established. They suggest a minimum of no less than 10% of regular operating revenues. A school must also establish a financial emergency plan, guidelines on how to respond to a crisis, defining what a crisis means, who can invoke it, and who is responsible for managing it. How will things like hiring and purchasing freezes be put in place? And what policies will be put in place to help the school recover? Financial managers also will need to develop long-term forecasts for 3 to 5 year periods. These forecasts should include predicted revenues, expenditures, and enrollment figures, as well as trend analysis for students in categories that may cost more to educate, such as students with autism spectrum disorder or ELL. Schools also need to budget for asset maintenance and replacement. The goal here should be to take an inventory of needs and define what mechanisms will be made to keep those needs current. When budgeting for staff compensation, GFOA recommends that you consider the full cost of staff rather than separating salary and benefits. They recommend that you do not use averages and instead look at the actual salary and benefits of each person. This will give you a more accurate picture to make better informed decisions. As mentioned previously, it is important to have a program review and sunset process in place. Consider a minimum time period for how often these reviews will be conducted, and state your willingness to consider other approaches and what criteria will be used to evaluate them. Make sure you define what a balanced budget means. GFOA suggests this definition, that the recurring revenues of the school equal or exceed their expenditures. It is important to define these parameters to ensure that the school has a balanced budget in place. It is quite common to have year-end savings at the end of the school year, but it is important to define what happens to these remaining funds. Most often they are rescinded and reallocated at the end of the year, but what this often encourages is a use it or lose it mentality among your managers. It is important to develop policies that encourage more strategic use of these funds. For example, you might consider a brief carryover period on a case-by-case basis, or allow joint decision-making between departments so that they can identify constructive and mutually beneficial uses of their remaining funds. When considering new programs, establish a preference for a pilot or experimental period. Then you can evaluate the program rigorously on its actual results. The costs of the program and its benefits should be evaluated up front before it is expanded into the rest of the school. I hope that my presentation helps us consider what some best practices may be when we are responsible for budgets in schools.